Black Cleaner thought she was alone. The boss saw everything, and what happened next was shocking. Interesting. Very interesting indeed, muttered Richard Thompson, watching through the crack in the closet door as Keisha Williams, the new cleaning lady, stood before the $15,000 deliberately scattered on the Italian marble dresser. The money test was Richard's specialty. At 45, heir to a real estate fortune, he had caught dozens of employees over the years with this cruel trap. Secretaries, drivers, nannies, housekeepers, they all invariably failed, proving his theory that poor people were naturally dishonest. Keisha was 38 years old and had 3 children to feed. She had been hired by the cleaning agency that Tuesday morning after the regular employee had been mysteriously fired. She didn't know she was walking straight into a calculated ambush. Richard held his breath, his cell phone camera already recording. It was always the same script: initial hesitation, nervous glances around, the hand approaching the money, and then, the moment of truth that would confirm all his prejudices. But Keisha did something completely unexpected. She took out her own cell phone, photographed the scattered money, and immediately called someone. Yes, it's a security emergency. There's $15,000 lying around here in the house where I'm working. The boss must have forgotten it. Someone could come in and steal it, she said, speaking quietly but clearly. I'm going to put it all in a safe place and leave him a note. Richard frowned, confused. That wasn't in the script. Keisha carefully gathered each bill, put everything in an envelope she found in the drawer, sealed it, wrote an explanatory note, and left everything clearly visible on the desk. Then she continued cleaning as if nothing had happened. For 3 hours, Richard watched this woman clean his mansion with a dedication he rarely saw. She organized bookshelves that hadn't been touched in months, cleaned pictures with almost artistic care, and even watered plants he had forgotten existed. When Keisha finished and left, Richard was disturbed in a way he couldn't explain. For the first time in 15 years of testing, someone had passed. And not just passed, she had acted with an integrity that made him question everything about himself. But what Richard didn't know was that Keisha had seen through the trick from the very beginning. And while he thought he had discovered a saint, she was calculating exactly how to use his arrogance against him. Because sometimes, when you've been underestimated your whole life, you learn to turn it into a weapon. If you're enjoying this story of how prejudice can backfire on those who practice it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what Keisha discovered about Richard in the days that followed was far more shocking than any honesty test. Richard couldn't sleep that night. The image of Keisha protecting his money bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. At 6 in the morning, he was already on the phone with the agency. I want the same cleaner as yesterday. Yes, Keisha Williams. I need her here 3 times a week. In fact, Richard was obsessed. 15 years of testing employees and he had finally found someone honest. Or at least that's what he thought. What Richard didn't know was that Keisha had grown up in Detroit, the daughter of a college professor who was fired for reporting racial discrimination at the college where she taught. She had learned from an early age to recognize traps disguised as opportunities. "Mom, this man is trying to test me," Keisha told her mother that night, while helping her children with their homework in her 2-bedroom apartment. He left $15,000 scattered on the dresser as if it were carelessness. Dorothy Williams, now 67 and retired, smiled bitterly. "Honey, I taught sociology for 30 years. I know these types. They do this to confirm their prejudices about us." "I know, Mom. That's why I photographed everything and pretended I was protecting him." "And what's your plan?" Keisha looked at her children, Marcus, 12, studying at a substandard public school, Aaliyah, 9, dreaming of becoming a doctor, and little Jaden, 6, who asked why they didn't have a house with a backyard like the kids on TV. "I'm still thinking about it. But this man will underestimate me until the very last second. And when he realizes who I really am, it will be too late." The following week, Richard intensified his tests. He left expensive jewelry scattered around the bathroom. He pretended to forget his wallet open with credit cards in plain sight. He even left the safe ajar with important documents visible. Keisha passed all the tests, always documenting everything, always protecting her boss from his own negligence. Richard was fascinated. During the 3 hours she worked, he watched her on the security monitors, analyzing her every move. Keisha cleaned with almost scientific precision, organized documents he had deliberately left in disarray, and even watered plants he had purposely let die to test whether she would meddle. Amazing, Richard muttered to himself, watching Keisha carefully water his orchids. I finally found one who's not like the others. But Richard couldn't put his prejudiced nature aside. He began making seemingly casual comments, testing Keisha's limits. You must be lucky to get to work in houses like this, he said in the second week, intercepting her in the kitchen. Yes, sir. I appreciate the opportunity, Keisha replied, maintaining the respectful tone he expected to hear. I imagine most people from your community wouldn't have the same discipline you have. Keisha felt her blood boil, but she smiled sweetly. You're right. Not everyone has an education. What Richard didn't know was that Keisha had earned a degree in business administration before becoming a single mother. She had worked in corporate offices for years until the 2008 crisis left her unemployed, and since then she had never been able to return to her field because of the gap in her resume and, of course, the veiled racism in the job market. With each condescending comment from Richard, Keisha mentally added another item to her list of evidence. She had started secretly recording their conversations using a cell phone app that her daughter Aaliyah, a little tech genius, had installed for her. You know, Keisha, Richard said in the third week, feeling comfortable with his own magnanimity, I'm thinking of giving you a bonus. You're different from the others who have worked here. Different how, sir? Well, you have values. Not like that last one I caught stealing money from my office. She was Latina, you know how it is. Keisha nodded understandingly, but inside she was documenting every word. The recorder in her pocket captured everything. Richard was increasingly confident that he had found the perfect employee, someone who confirmed his theory that good people were rare, especially among the less fortunate. He even began bragging to his friends at the club. I finally found one who's good, he told his friend Bradley over dinner at the country club. Black, but polite, you know? Not like the others who just want to steal. Bradley laughed. Be careful, Richard. Sometimes the quiet ones are the worst. My maid was like that too. 5 years later I found out she was selling information about my routine to burglars. No, this one's different. I've tested her in every way. She's really honest. What neither of them knew was that Keisha was at the next table, serving drinks disguised in a uniform borrowed from a friend who worked as a waitress at the club. It was one of the many skills she had developed to supplement her income. She heard every word. She recorded every word. And when Richard came home the next night, he found his house impeccably clean as always, a polite note from Keisha explaining that she had finished early, and he had no idea that his perfect employee now had enough material to destroy not only his reputation, but the entire structure of privilege he used to humiliate people like her. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge comes disguised as subservience, and the smartest are those who know when to pretend to be exactly what their oppressors expect them to be. What Richard couldn't imagine was that every test, every prejudiced comment, every moment of arrogance was being carefully documented by someone who had long ago learned that patience is the most powerful weapon against those who underestimate you. Over the next few weeks, Keisha turned every day at Richard's house into an intelligence operation. While he thought he had found the perfect employee, she was methodically building a dossier that would destroy not only his reputation but the entire structure of privilege he used as a weapon. The first step was to map Richard's routine and contacts. She discovered that he was on the board of 3 charitable organizations, all focused on helping underserved communities, where he used his supposed kindness to secure millions in tax benefits while making racist comments about the very people he was supposed to be helping. This diversity thing is just for show, she heard him say on the phone to a partner. I hire 1 or 2 for the photos, and the rest stay in the kitchen where they've always been. Keisha recorded everything. But she needed more than recordings. She needed someone who understood the system from the inside. That's when she decided to reach out to her cousin Jennifer, a labor rights lawyer who had graduated from Harvard but whom many clients rejected as soon as they saw her in person. Cousin, I need your help, Keisha said in a late-night phone call. I have a case that will interest you. Jennifer Williams Carter was 41 years old and had built a brilliant career against all odds. She had represented dozens of racial discrimination cases, always with surgical precision that left her opponents with no way out. Tell me everything, Jennifer said, and when Keisha finished recounting the last few months, there was silence on the other end of the line. Keisha, do you have any idea what you just handed me? This man isn't just your average racist. Richard Thompson sits on the board of the Urban Hope Foundation, which receives $15 million a year in donations for educational programs in black communities. If we can prove that he embezzles this money while keeping black employees in conditions of systematic humiliation. Can you sue him? I can destroy his entire empire. But we'll need more evidence. And you'll have to put up with this charade a little longer. In the days that followed, Keisha intensified her strategy. She began asking seemingly innocent questions about Richard's business, always maintaining the submissive tone he expected. Mr. Richard, those Urban Hope Foundation papers on the desk. Can I clean them up, or do you need them to stay there? You can take them away, Keisha. It's just boring paperwork. You wouldn't understand these things. But before removing them, she photographed each document. Richard was becoming increasingly confident. He had begun to treat Keisha as a confidant, sharing his opinions on how to deal with these people during coffee breaks. You know, Keisha, you should give lectures to others in your community. Explain how to behave in family homes. Most of them don't have an education like you. You're right. Maybe I should. What Richard didn't know was that Keisha was indeed giving lectures to Jennifer and a growing network of lawyers specializing in financial crimes and racial discrimination. The turning point came when Richard made his biggest mistake. During a party at his house, he invited Keisha to serve drinks to the guests, all white, wealthy, influential men. He wanted to show her off as proof that he wasn't racist. Everyone, this is Keisha, my model employee. Proof that when they want to, they can behave appropriately. The guests laughed, made jokes about training employees, and Richard recorded everything on his cell phone for posterity. Keisha served champagne with a sweet smile, but her eidetic memory was cataloging every face, every name, every company mentioned. She recognized the mayor, 2 city councilors, the director of one of the city's largest construction companies, and the CEO of the auditing firm that approved the Urban Hope Foundation's accounts. When the party ended, Richard was elated. See, Keisha? When you guys try hard, you can even impress important people. Yes, sir. I learned a lot today. She really had learned. She had learned exactly who else was involved in the network of corruption and discrimination that Richard ran. That night, Keisha called Jennifer with a list of names that left the lawyer speechless for several seconds. Cousin, you just handed me the biggest money laundering scheme disguised as charity I've ever seen in my life. And they all incriminated themselves voluntarily. What do we do now? Now. Jennifer smiled on the other end of the line. Now we're going to show these people what happens when they underestimate a black woman who knows exactly what she's worth. Richard continued his tests, each one more elaborate, each one more humiliating. He made Keisha clean bathrooms twice, redo beds that were already spotless, reorganize bookshelves that were already organized. All to maintain the standard of excellence. But with each new humiliation, Keisha added more evidence to the growing dossier. Recordings, photos, documents, bank account numbers, proof of suspicious transfers. The folder Jennifer was putting together now had over 200 pages. And when Richard finally decided to take the next step, publicly firing her at a foundation board meeting to demonstrate how to deal with problematic employees, even though she had never caused any problems, he had no idea that he was walking straight into the abyss he himself had dug. Because sometimes arrogance is so blind that it turns predators into prey, and Richard was about to discover that the woman he thought he had tamed was actually conducting a symphony of justice that would resonate far beyond the walls of his privileged mansion. The Urban Hope Foundation board meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m. Richard had called a special session, promising members a practical demonstration of human resource management in charitable organizations. 15 people were present in the elegant conference room, the mayor, city councilors, business leaders, all part of the elite that Richard ruled with an iron fist disguised as philanthropy. Gentlemen, Richard began, adjusting his $3,000 suit, I have brought you here today to witness how we deal with problematic employees. It's a matter of maintaining standards. Keisha entered the room as instructed, pushing a coffee cart. She wore the same navy blue uniform as always, but today there was something different in her eyes, a calmness that Richard misinterpreted as resignation. This is Keisha Williams, Richard announced to the group. She worked for me for 3 months. Initially promising, but unfortunately, well, you'll understand. What Richard didn't know was that Jennifer was outside the building with a team of lawyers, FBI agents specializing in financial crimes, and 3 investigative journalists from the city's largest media outlets. Keisha, Richard continued, his voice taking on that condescending tone she knew so well, Can you explain to the board why you failed to follow the specific instructions I gave you yesterday? It was a lie, of course. Richard had never given any instructions. But Keisha knew this was the pretext he would use to fire her publicly, creating a spectacle of humiliation. Mr. Richard, Keisha said calmly, before answering your question, I would like to make a short presentation to the board. Richard frowned. Presentation? You're not here to. I'm sure you'll be very interested in what I've discovered during these 3 months working so closely with Mr. Richard. The tone in Keisha's voice had changed. It was no longer submissive, no longer respectful. It was professional, confident, dangerous. Richard felt something cold run down his spine. Keisha, you're dismissed. You may leave now. Actually, a familiar voice sounded from the door. She's exactly where she needs to be. Jennifer entered the room, followed by 2 federal agents and a bailiff. Gentlemen of the board, my name is Jennifer Williams Carter, a federal attorney specializing in financial crimes. I am here to present evidence of a money laundering scheme and systematic racial discrimination involving this foundation and everyone in this room. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard was white as a sheet. This is ridiculous, he stammered. You can't just walk in here like this. Yes, I can, Jennifer smiled, placing a briefcase on the table. I have here a court order authorizing a full investigation of this foundation and the preventive arrest of at least 5 people in this room. Keisha approached the conference table, took her cell phone out of her pocket, and activated a projector that Jennifer had discreetly installed. Gentlemen, Keisha said, her voice echoing through the room, for 3 months, I have systematically documented the criminal activities of Mr. Richard Thompson and all of you. The first image appeared on the wall, Richard counting the $15,000 before spreading them on the dresser. Here we see Mr. Thompson preparing what he calls the money test, a cruel trap used to humiliate black employees and justify his prejudices. Murmurs of discomfort rippled through the room. The second image, Richard speaking at the country club. Black, but educated, you know? Not like those others who just want to steal, Richard's voice echoed through the projector speakers. The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. But that's nothing, Keisha continued, compared to what we've discovered about this foundation's embezzlement. The screen now showed detailed spreadsheets, bank transfers, and receipts for suspicious payments. $15 million annually in donations to educational programs in black communities. Jennifer took over the presentation, of which only $2.8 million actually reaches the schools. The rest is divided among shell companies controlled by the gentlemen present in this room. Richard tried to stand up. This is a hoax. A setup. Sit down, Mr. Thompson, the federal agent ordered. You are being recorded, and anything you say can be used against you. Keisha moved on to the next piece of evidence, recordings of Richard's phone conversations discussing how to keep these blacks in their place, while embezzling money intended for the education of these same people's children. For 3 months, Keisha said, looking directly at Richard, you thought you were testing my honesty. In fact, I was testing yours. The screen now showed Richard instructing accountants to falsify financial reports, sign documents diverting educational funds, emails discussing how to cut the budget without anyone noticing. You failed miserably, Keisha continued, in every possible way. The CEO of the auditing firm stood up abruptly, trying to leave the room. He was stopped by the second federal agent. No one leaves until we're done, Jennifer announced. Richard was visibly shaking now. You can't do this to me. I helped you. I paid you well. You systematically humiliated me for 3 months, Keisha replied. You made me serve drinks to your friends while you made jokes about training employees. You tested me as if I were an animal. And worst of all, you stole money intended to provide education for children like my own. The presentation continued for another 20 minutes. Each piece of evidence was more damning than the last. Suspicious bank transfers, recordings of discriminatory conversations, forged documents, fraudulent contracts. When it was over, 5 people were in handcuffs, including Richard. 3 others, including the mayor, were being questioned. The foundation would be taken over by the federal government. Keisha, Richard said as he was led away by the agents, his voice broke and desperate, please. I have a family. I can change. Keisha looked at him with a serenity that made everyone present realize who really had the power in that room. Mr. Richard, she said calmly, You had 3 months to show me who you really were. Now I've shown the world who you really are." As Richard was led through the corridors of the building toward the police car, Keisha remained in the hall, helping Jennifer organize the documents. Through the window, she could see the television cameras already positioning themselves outside. The story would be on all the news that night. Richard Thompson's empire had collapsed in less than an hour. But as the handcuffs clicked around Richard's wrists and the camera flashes captured his spectacular fall, one question still hung in the air. How had a woman he tried to break not only managed to survive, but orchestrate a symphony of justice so perfect that it would reverberate far beyond those walls of privilege? 18 months later, Keisha Williams sat in her new office on the 23rd floor of a commercial building in downtown. The sign on the door read K. Williams Consulting, Auditing and Compliance in Social Organizations. Her company had grown meteorically after the story of how she exposed Richard's scheme went viral. Charitable organizations across the country hired her services to ensure they weren't being used as fronts for money laundering or racial discrimination. "Mom, 5 more proposals came in today," said Aaliyah, now 11, entering the office with a stack of contracts. The girl had become a little business genius, helping to organize her mother's company papers in the afternoons after private school, where she studied on a full scholarship earned on her own merit. Across town, Richard Thompson woke up to another day in his 1-bedroom apartment in a lower-middle-class neighborhood. The man who once owned a 15-room mansion now shared his space with cockroaches and noisy neighbors. His conviction for money laundering, fraud, and racial discrimination had resulted in 4 years in prison, of which he served 2. But the court sentence was only the beginning of his downfall. His fortune was confiscated, his assets auctioned off, and what was left was used to compensate the victims of his schemes. Richard had tried to get a job at several companies after leaving prison, but his name was permanently associated with the scandal. Every Google search returned articles about the racist millionaire who was brought down by his own cleaning lady. He now worked as a night janitor in a commercial building, ironically cleaning the same types of offices he once ruled. Jennifer Williams Carter had become one of the most respected lawyers in the country, specializing in racial discrimination cases. The Richard Thompson case was cited in law schools as a perfect example of how meticulously collected evidence can destroy seemingly untouchable corruption schemes. "Do you know what impresses me most about this story?" Jennifer said during a lecture at Harvard University, speaking to a room full of future lawyers. "It wasn't the revenge my cousin sought. It was justice." She could have simply reported Richard for discrimination and won a labor lawsuit. But she chose to expose the entire corrupt system he represented. Dorothy Williams, now 69, lived with Keisha and her grandchildren in the 5-bedroom house her daughter had bought in an upscale neighborhood. Every morning she watered the rose garden she had planted, smiling as she remembered the days when they barely had enough money to pay the rent. "Grandma," asked Marcus, now 14 and captain of the school math team, "do you think that bad man learned anything?" Dorothy stopped watering the flowers and looked at her grandson. "My dear, some people only learn when they lose everything. But the important thing is not whether he learned. The important thing is that your mother taught the whole world that dignity is priceless and that those who underestimate people because of the color of their skin are choosing the losing side of history." Keisha had received offers to write a book, participate in documentaries, and even adapt her story for the cinema. But she remained focused on her work. Her company had already identified irregularities in dozens of organizations, recovered millions of dollars that had been embezzled, and created transparency protocols that became standard in the industry. On the last Friday of every month, she did something special. She visited schools in poor neighborhoods and talked to young people about persistence, education, and dignity. During one of these visits, a 12-year-old girl raised her hand. "Ms. Williams, how did you know you were going to defeat that rich and powerful man?" Keisha smiled, remembering herself at the same age, dreaming of a future that seemed impossible. "I didn't know if I would succeed, dear. But I knew one thing: when you are right, when you fight for what is right, and when you never give up on your values, the universe conspires in your favor. It may take time, it may be difficult, but the truth always finds its way." Richard Thompson tried to contact Keisha a few times after he got out of prison. He sent letters asking for forgiveness, offering to testify on her behalf in other cases, even proposing to work for her to make up for his past mistakes. She never replied. Not out of cruelty, but because some wounds only heal with distance, and some people only deserve to be forgotten. The last time they crossed paths was by chance, at a traffic light. Richard was on the bus taking him to his night shift at work. Keisha was in her new car, returning from a meeting with executives from a large corporation that wanted to implement her compliance protocols. Their eyes met for 2 seconds through the windows. Richard lowered his head, ashamed. Keisha just drove on, without anger, without sadness, just with the peace of mind of someone who knows that justice has been done. Because the best revenge has never been to destroy those who have hurt you. The best revenge is to build something so great, so meaningful, that your enemies become mere footnotes in the story of your success. Richard thought he was testing Keisha's honesty, but he ended up discovering that it was he who was being tested by life. And while he failed miserably in every way, Keisha proved that integrity, patience, and intelligence always triumph over prejudice and arrogance. If this story of how karma finds its way has inspired you, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. We have more real stories of justice that will show you that, in the end, he who laughs last always laughs best.